And with that, I'll pass the floor to our Executive Director, Nathaniel Stinnett.
Thank you, Ren. And thank you to everybody for joining us this evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. Oh, man, is it so good to see all of you. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And today is kind of going to be like a weird hybrid of an event. So let me share some slides here and go to this. I always find it helpful to have kind of like a run of show or a table of contents. Maybe you do too. So I'm going to start with a very, very quick introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. Just for those of you who are old hat to EVP, please understand there are some people on who aren't. And so I do want to just briefly describe what EVP is, what we do, and why we do it. For those of you who are new to EVP, please understand that we're going to try to get through some Houston voter file data and have a full phone bank tonight. So if you are looking for a full, in-depth, deeply covered introduction to the Environmental Voter Project, I'm sorry, you're not going to get it tonight, but hopefully you will get a nice sort of appetizer that will get you excited about our work. Then we're going to get into the Houston voter data briefing. Then, as Ren mentioned, we're going to have a very, very brief Q&A session, 1, 2, maybe 3 questions. And then the phone bank will start. For those of you who have phone banked with us before and know how it's done, Ren will give you the link and the script, and you'll be able to just get started right away. For those of you who have not called with us before, Ren will walk you through and train you on all the stuff that you need to know. And for all of you, whether you're first-time callers, you've been doing this for a long time, Ren and also Bethany, who you'll meet, are going to be on here to help you the entire time. All right? And then after the end of the phone bank, when you turn dozens, maybe hundreds of non-voting environmentalists into first-time voters, then there will be a very, very quick sort of feedback and debrief session. Sound good? All right, gosh, we've got even more people joining us. This is great. Let's get started. For those of you who are new to the Environmental Voter Project, in a nutshell, I think the best way to describe our nonprofit is the very short sentence that you see there. We turn non-voting environmentalists into consistent voters. That's it. Another way to think about us, a lot of people think we're data science and behavioral science. So we use data science to individually identify all these people who are registered to vote and care deeply about climate and the environment, yet they don't actually show up. They're not actually voting. And that's when we can go in and deliver this behavioral science-informed messaging just to turn them into better voters. Because this is a group of people who doesn't need their minds changed. They don't need to be educated about issues. All they need is this behavioral intervention. That's what we do with the Environmental Voter Project. What is also important to point out is what that means we don't do. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to convince people to care more about climate change or the environment. Again, we're solely in this behavior change space, finding people who are already with us yet not voting, and then using tested messaging to turn them into better voters. And the reason we are so laser focused on this is it turns out there is an enormous number of non-voting environmentalists. Just these numbers that you see here are already registered voters. They're already registered, who are likely to list climate or clean air, clean water, and the environment as literally their number one priority over all other issues. Yet they did not vote. 13 million of them last year in the midterm election. Over 8 million in the most recent presidential election. These people are already registered. They're just not walking out the door on election day. And I see some of you shaking your heads in frustration, and I get it, I know. But what I would like to suggest to you is that this is an opportunity. because we live in a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds, especially about climate and environmental issues. And what these huge populations of people represent are people who don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not. But it is easier and it is cheaper than changing people's opinions. And perhaps most importantly, it's messaging that you can test, because whether you vote or not is public record. And so that means we can run randomized control trials and other sophisticated experiments and go and look at public voter files and see which messages are working and which messages aren't working, which is something you really can't do if you're trying to change someone's opinion about climate change, because often you won't get an honest answer back, or they won't tell you who they voted for in the privacy of the voting booth. So that's why we are so laser focused on this particular opportunity, identifying these huge numbers of non-voting environmentalists so that we can just deliver this behavioral intervention to them. We do it in this 4-step process, and this is going to be one of those places where, please forgive me, if you're new to the Environmental Voter Project, I'm not going to go into an enormous amount of depth here. We are going to provide some links where you can learn more, and we would always welcome you back to one of our more in-depth briefings. But very, very quickly, how do we find these non-voting environmentalists and then turn them into consistent voters? Well, the first step, identification. We build predictive models on voter files. And I could go on for, I teach an entire 1.5 hour long seminar on this, and I'm not going to do that, but I'll try to do it in 2 minutes. How about that? The way these predictive models work is we start by polling enormous numbers of people. Let's say 10,000 people in Texas. But all we're asking them is one question, that is, what is your number one most important political priority? Let's say 1,000 out of those 10,000 say climate change, clean air, environmental justice, some environmental issue. Well, then we've isolated a group of people who have self-identified and said, hey, yeah, this is my number one issue. And that's gold. Because then what we can do is we can start working with data scientists to say, okay, what do we know about these 1,000 people? What data is there in voter files? What census data is there? What publicly available behavioral and consumer data is there? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of it out there, and it's really rich, informative information. And then it's a long process, but what that enables us to do is start finding other people on the Texas voter file who are a lot like those 1,000 who self-identified as being climate first voters. And there are lots of different clusters of people, but some of them might be, oh, if you're a Latina grandmother within 10 miles of Katy and bought a Volvo between 2 and 4 years ago and subscribed to National Geographic, well, you've got a 92% likelihood of listing climate as your top priority. Or if you are a Black grandfather living in El Paso who likes to buy outdoor exercise magazines, maybe you have a 77%. And there are lots of different profiles, and we go and we start assigning probabilistic scores to every single individual voter in the voter file. And at the end of the day, what we are able to do is identify with honestly a frightening amount of accuracy which are the individuals who have a greater than 85% likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but quite literally listing it as their number one priority over all others. Now, does that mean we've spoken to every single individual Texan? No, of course not. But what we've been able to do, kind of like an insurance company building an actuarial table, is we've been able to make a probabilistic determination of who are the Texans who, like 9 times out of 10, climate is going to be their number one issue. And we test it and retest it, and these are always extraordinarily accurate. What that then allows us to do is isolate the ones of those who don't vote or who are unlikely to vote. We don't need fancy data scientists for that, right? Whether you vote or not is public record. Then that leaves us with this population of people who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet are unlikely to vote. We can then move to step 2, mobilization. At this point, we've got people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change, right? And so now we can be completely agnostic with our messaging. We could talk about chocolate chip cookies if that's what it takes to get these people to vote. And so now in this step 2, mobilization, we can take advantage of the latest cutting edge behavioral psychology and behavioral economics to simply use whatever messaging works best to turn these non-voting environmentalists into new voters. We work with thousands of volunteers around the country. We canvass, we call, we mail, we send digital ads, all to these voters using messaging that's optimized to do just one thing, and that is get them to vote. And perhaps what's most important and most interesting is step 3, habit reinforcement. You don't need, like us, to be someone who lives behavioral science each day to intuitively be able to understand that you can't change people's habits by only talking to them once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. That's not how you change non-voters into super voters. And so another special thing that we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we try to use every election possible as a precious behavioral intervention opportunity. I mean, I know it sounds banal, but the only way you can turn a non-voter into a voter is to get them to vote in an election, right? And so we think, how dare we let an election pass us by without taking advantage of this opportunity? And then 4, ultimately, our goal is to change the electorate. Ultimately, whether you're running for dog catcher or president or mayor of Houston, we want you to look at your polling data of likely voters and say, holy moly, where did all these environmentalists come from? Because when that happens, not only do we start electing better climate leaders, but even more importantly than that, no matter whom we elect, those people then have a greater willingness to spend their political capital on climate. And that's so important to understand, because oftentimes we elect the so-called right people, but we all know that doesn't mean they can just snap their fingers and get whatever they want done, right? They still need to decide what to spend their precious political capital on. And right now, I'm sure this comes as no surprise to any of you, we in the climate movement don't have nearly enough political power, not even close. And that's not because we don't have the facts on our side. That's not because we don't have policies on our side. It's because most politicians can win elections by not prioritizing our issues. And we need to change that. We need to change that. So this is what we do. We operate in these 19 states. We just earlier this year expanded into Louisiana and Nebraska. If you want more information about the Environmental Voter Project, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/about. Very quickly, some of our results. We measure our impact in 2 different ways. First, in specific elections, we run what's called randomized control trials. Very, very briefly, what this means is before we talk to anybody, we set aside some of these low propensity environmental voters in a control group and never talk to them. Then the remaining 80–85%, those are the ones we mobilize. And then after the election, we're able to compare turnout and isolate what our sole impact was on turnout, which is really, really important. We want to be able to prove to our volunteers and our donors what we are able to achieve. We know that we have probably mobilized voters, we've probably increased turnout, rather, in thousands of elections. But many of them are so small that we can't prove it, and that's why we need these randomized control trials. And what we know is just over the last 4 years, we have been solely responsible for increasing turnout while controlling for all outside variables in dozens of elections. Local elections, We've increased turnout as much as 4 percentage points over our control group. Primaries as much as 3.6 percentage points. General elections as much as 1.8 percentage points over our control group. And these numbers might not seem big to you, but ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.8 percentage points is in Pennsylvania. He'll tell you. These are big numbers in this business, and we're very, very proud of them. The second way that we measure our impact is over the long term. Since we launched almost 7 years ago, we have now communicated with over 9.5 million unique individual voters. So once we reach someone on the phone or at the door or with a mail piece, we tag them in the voter file and we track them. And what we know is, by definition, all 9.5 million of these people care deeply about climate and the environment, and were unlikely to vote in at least an election, or we wouldn't have reached out to them, right? Well, as of this February, almost 1.5 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters, such that even if you were running for library trustee, you'd say, I got to go and knock on that person's door. And maybe more importantly, I got to ask them what issues they care about. Now, I want to be clear. This second long-term metric, this doesn't have the scientific rigor of the previous metric, a randomized control trial. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters. In fact, we are probably not solely responsible for that. But we're pretty darn responsible. There's no other organization that's been involved in now close to 2,000 different elections over the past 7 years, working year in, year out in these dinky little races to try to change people's habits. If you want to learn more about our results, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/results. I told you it would be a quick intro to EVP, and that was pretty darn quick. Let's get to Houston data, and here we go. So one of the reasons we are in Houston is because we are in Texas, and we think Texas is a very important state. But more particular to Houston, I know that many of you on the line right now are in Houston and know Houston politics certainly better than I do. But just a few things that are important to highlight. One, there is significant fossil fuel infrastructure in and around Houston, but also, literally within the city limits. And that's important not only because it impacts people's daily lives, and at the end of the day, that's what we want politics to do, right? But also because it does give some measure of control over municipal politics, where municipal politicians are able to deal with zoning and siting and other fossil fuel infrastructure issues, which you might not have in other places where it's mostly county or state or federal control. Second thing is, more than almost any other major urban area, Houston is at the front lines of almost every environmental crisis you can imagine right now. This is where these crises are hurting people, if not the most, pretty darn close to the most. Louisiana's given you a run for your money, but you're up there. And so this is where we are needed. Third, no matter how proud we are of all of our experiments and all of our messaging and all of the results that we get, I have to admit that what makes us pretty darn good isn't necessarily our intelligence, it's more our stubbornness. The more we talk to voters, the better our results are going to be. It's just that simple. And another important thing that Houston and all of Texas has going for it is you have an active election calendar in odd years and not just even years. And that gives us these extra bites at the apple. If we can talk to someone every year rather than every other year, our ability to change their behavior is so much greater. And then when you add on top of that, the fact that you often have runoff elections, well, holy moly. There are some of these people we can talk to for like 6, 7, 8 different elections a year. That's just gold. Whereas in a place like Oregon, where there are also lots of non-voting environmentalists, we wouldn't even be able to talk to people except in even years, and then only twice. That's the reason why we're not in Oregon. And then finally, there are a huge number of non-voting and seldom voting environment first voters in Houston, Texas. This is a huge opportunity for the environmental movement and the broader progressive movement. Who are these voters? Well, we have identified 62,724 of them who are registered to vote, but did not vote in the last presidential election, even though they were eligible to. So they're registered. They have a very high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as literally their number one priority, yet they didn't even vote in a presidential. As far as this year, people who are registered to vote, list climate or the environment as their top priority, yet do not have a history of voting in odd year elections, well, there are like 160,000 of them. We are targeting 138,000 because remember, we set some people aside in a control group. That's how we're able to measure our impact. So we are targeting 138,000. All right. What does that number mean? We wanted to provide you some context. Well, there are about 1.2 million registered voters in Houston. So that means that over 10% of the registered voters in Houston are super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote in this mayoral election. That's a huge potential, only potential, block of political power. Let's provide some more context. 2019, there was an incumbent running for re-election, but in 2015, the last time there was an open mayoral election, 269,000 people voted. Now, Houston was smaller then. You don't need me to tell you how quickly Houston is growing. But still, that gives you an idea. If only 261,000 ballots were cast 8 years ago when there was an open mayoral election, this 138,000 person population of unlikely to vote environmentalists is a big deal. If we can get 2 or 5% of them to vote, that could be a difference maker. All right, who are these people? I'm going to rush through this because I want to get to the Q&A and then we've got the phone back. Well, if you look down here, you'll see 2 rows. This one says EVP targets. So these are the people, these are that 138,000. Super environmentalists who are registered to vote, yet unlikely to do so either November 7th or December 9th in the runoff. Below that, this row are all registered voters in Houston. So EVP targets are also registered, but I wanted to give you sort of what the background data is. So what's some interesting stuff we've noticed here? Well, EVP targets, these low propensity environmental voters in Houston, are disproportionately young, right? Probably not a surprise that people who care deeply about climate and the environment yet are unlikely to vote are disproportionately young. So about 80% of this target population we're looking at, about 75% of this target population we're looking at is under the age of 35. But, and this is something that we see in all of our states and all of our cities, as far as I know, notice it's not as simple as the older you get, the fewer low propensity environmental voters there are. Kind of swings back up when you hit that 65 and up age group. Do you see that? See that it goes back up to 8.2%? We see that everywhere. Don't let people tell you that boomers don't care about climate change. The problem is me. The problem is Gen X. We're the ones who have the problem. We are seeing that people over the age of 65 are actually the second largest age group when it comes to caring deeply about climate and the environment, if you combine 18 to 34-year-olds. Okay, that's the first demographic trend that we're seeing. The second is a really significant gender gap. And this is something that we don't necessarily see everywhere. We usually see a small gender gap, but in Houston, it's pretty enormous. So if you look at all registered voters, there is like a 6-point gender gap where women are 6 percentage points more prevalent in the electorate than men. when you look at EVP's targets, these unlikely to vote super environmentalists, there's an 18-point gender gap. So it's 3 times as large. What's going on there? Well, I'll tell you, it actually has nothing to do with vote propensity. If instead I was showing you data not of low propensity environmental voters, but just plain old environmental voters, you'd still see that gender gap. And we see that not everywhere, but in a lot of places. Women are just more likely to care deeply about climate and the environment than men are. All right. And then in the racial data here, this is something that is pretty unique. When we look at pretty much all of our states, our target population at EVP is disproportionately Black, disproportionately AAPI, and disproportionately Native American. That is not the case in Houston. In Houston, our target population is not much whiter, but about 9 percentage points whiter than the overall population of registered voters. We do still see that it's a disproportionately made up of Asian American and Pacific Islanders. And I can tell you, if you broadened the aperture and looked at Texas statewide, you would see that our target population is disproportionately Black. It is disproportionately AAPI. It is not disproportionately white. That's only in Houston. The Hispanic numbers are still, Hispanic voters are still underrepresented in our target population in Texas, I believe. So that's the other thing that we saw. I'm taking a little bit longer than I want, so I'm going to just go to the finish here. This is a density map. Obviously, not every dot represents one voter. They represent a cluster of voters, but this is where we have identified these clusters of unlikely to vote this year super environmentalists. Okay, before we get to the Q&A, I just want to let you know, today, after we do this brief Q&A, reminder, you're going to have a training for those of you who need it, and then you're going to get on the phones and call these low propensity environmental voters. And remember what I told you about all these randomized control trials we run? The script you are going to be using has been proven with statistically significant results to increase turnout 1.1 percentage points. And that actually was in Texas. I think we did that experiment in the March 1st primary last year, 2022. If you are interested in getting on another phone bank, please sign up 2 days from now. Piper Parabo. I don't know if you know Piper. She's originally from Texas. She's an actress and activist. She's one of the stars in the Yellowstone show. She's been in a lot of movies. She is amazing. You will love her. She's far more interesting than I am. And we would love to have you join our GOTV phone banks from November 3rd through the 7th. But in particular, we know that we will be calling into Houston on the 6th and 7th during those dates. And then as soon as early voting starts for the runoff, because I think we can safely say there will most likely be a runoff in the mayoral election, we're going to get right back at it. So stay tuned for that. All right. I would love to take some questions. I meant to have this last only until about 5 minutes ago. So I went over a little bit, but I would love to take some questions. Ren, do we have any?
Yes, we actually have 2 questions, one from Jane and one from Jay. First, I'll ask Jane's question. This was asked during the slide 9, EVP's cumulative impact. Jane asked, I was going to ask, was it controlled for things like the fact that these people age, for instance? Still good numbers.
Yes. So on the cumulative impact, what we do is, so it's a very, very good question, Jane. On the cumulative impact, first, I just want to say, remember, those numbers are not like a randomized control trial. So unlike our first election-specific data set, we cannot claim we are solely responsible for making those things, for that cumulative impact. However, what we do is, whenever we run those numbers, which is usually like twice a year, we only include people who still have these perfect voting records. And so if you miss any election, you fall out. You fall out of this sort of group that we consider graduates or things like that. And so, yes, it does take that into consideration. I'm not sure if that's what you meant by controlling for age, but it does take into consideration that all of these people are going through more and more elections, even if we're no longer targeting them. Because this gets to the very reason why we can't run long-term, multi-year randomized control trials. We could do that if we wanted to target the same people year after year after year. But we don't want to do that, right? Like there are, well, for instance, there are some people we're going to be calling tonight who are unlikely to vote in a mayoral election, but they're really likely to vote in a presidential election. So we don't want to target them next year. That's a waste of your time and a waste of our time. And so our target population expands and contracts not only throughout the year, but across multiple years. And because of that, there aren't like even through lines through the years where we can run these long-term randomized control trials, if that makes sense. Great question, though.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, Nathaniel. And thanks, Jane. The second one is from Jay. It's actually a two-parter, so I'm going to condense them together. This was asked during slide 13, transitioning to slide 14. Is there a breakdown of apartment dwellers in single-family houses? And my favorite question is that, are there any neighborhoods at all have enough density to canvass?
Great question, Jay. So I don't have that data in my head, but we can absolutely get it to you. Because when we do run canvassing analyses, that's precisely the thing that we do. We figure out, we don't just use apartment dwellers, we also look at whether there are gated communities and high rises and things like that. So all I can tell you is we can run that data. We would be happy to follow up with it. It might happen tomorrow. It might happen the day after tomorrow, but we will follow up with it. Up until last year, our approach to canvassing was, if there are people who want to canvass, let's make it happen. And there was a lot that was good about that, but it almost guaranteed that we knocked on an extraordinarily small number of doors in a large number of places. And it was in some ways a little bit counter to what we're trying to do with the Environmental Voter Project, which is build up this political power in particular places over time. And so rightly, I think, we decided to take pretty much the polar opposite approach starting last year. And we just said, you know what, let's look at all the places where we're working and figure out where is the greatest canvassable density of these low propensity environmental voters, and lots of volunteers who might be eager to canvass. That analysis led us to starting 3 canvassing hubs: Austin, Texas, Tucson, Arizona, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We may be adding to that list sometime soon or changing it around a little bit. So if behind your question, Jay, was an eagerness to perhaps knock on doors, boy, are we happy to dig into this data for you. Let's put it that way. All right. Thank you all for your questions. Please, my email address is nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org. I also can be reached just at info@environmentalvoter.org if that's easier for you to remember. I would be happy to answer any remaining questions you have. But I want to finish by just thanking you. I know that this was kind of weird. This was a really quick intro to the Environmental Voter Project. If you want to learn more about our work, please stick with us. I think that we value our volunteers, if not more than other groups, as much as the best groups out there. And it's a great organization to be a part of, I think. And I hope that you'll stay on and call these low propensity environmental voters. You will love working with Ren. You'll love working with Bethany. And I really hope to hear from you over email or see you on a longer, calmer introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. All right. Thank you, everybody.